The quiet streets of Greenview Heights had always seemed safe, almost serene, with their neatly trimmed lawns and tree-lined avenues. But on this particular night, under the pale glow of a crescent moon, something unexpected was about to unfold, something that would shatter the calm and leave the neighborhood buzzing for weeks. Officer Ray Doyle wasn't your average cop. To most, he was a dependable figure in the community, sharp, confident, and seemingly always in control. But beneath the polished badge and tidy uniform lay a man with a knack for pushing boundaries. Tonight, his instincts and a reckless sense of entitlement were about to lead him down a dangerous path. The scene began at a large colonial-style house on the corner of Maple and Fifth. It stood out not just because of its impressive size or perfectly maintained exterior, but because of its history. The home belonged to none other than retired General Elijah Monroe, a highly decorated officer in the United States Army, one of the first black generals to make his mark on military history. To the world, he was a symbol of strength and integrity, a man who had broken barriers and commanded respect wherever he went. But to Ray Doyle, the significance of who owned the house didn't matter, or so he thought. Earlier that day, rumors had swirled about the old general's home. A friend of a friend, Doyle claimed, had let slip that there was something hidden inside, a safe tucked away in the study, holding valuable items that could fetch a fortune. No one really knew what was inside, but the mystery made it even more enticing. For Doyle, the allure of easy money mixed with the adrenaline of doing something forbidden became too tempting to resist. As he approached the house, the neighborhood was silent, the only sound the faint chirping of crickets. Dressed in dark clothing, Doyle moved with precision. His police training made him a natural at slipping through spaces unnoticed. He bypassed the security system, smugly confident in his ability to outwit whatever challenges lay ahead. For him, this wasn't just about the potential loot. It was about proving to himself that he could do it. Inside, the house was eerily still, every shadow stretching long across the polished wooden floors. Doyle's flashlight cut through the darkness as he moved room to room, careful not to disturb anything that might hint at his presence. Finally, he found what he was looking for, a large old-fashioned safe bolted to the floor in the general's study. Its heavy steel door gleamed faintly in the dim light. Doyle smirked. This was it. This was the moment where all his careful planning would pay off. Pulling out tools he had stashed away, he knelt by the safe, feeling the rush of adrenaline coursing through him. With each turn of the lock, his confidence grew. He was good at this, too good, and he knew it. What he didn't know was that General Monroe was a man who believed in being prepared. Not just in battle, but in every aspect of life. The safe wasn't just protected by an intricate locking system, it was booby-trapped. A mechanism lay hidden inside, designed to spray a burst of bright red paint the moment the wrong combination was entered. It wasn't lethal, but it was unforgettable, a mark that couldn't be easily wiped away. As Doyle pressed what he thought was the final digit in the code, the safe hissed and clicked. For a moment, he thought he had won. But then, with a loud asterisk pop asterisk, the trap was sprung. A jet of paint exploded outward, hitting him square in the face and chest. The bright red liquid clung to him, dripping down his uniform and staining his skin. Doyle staggered back, coughing and cursing as the acrid smell of the paint filled his nostrils. He tried wiping it off, but the sticky substance clung stubbornly. In his panic, he didn't hear the soft click of a light switch behind him or the heavy footsteps approaching. "Can I help you, officer?" The voice was calm, steady, and unmistakably commanding. Doyle froze, his heart pounding. Slowly, he turned, his eyes widening as he saw the towering figure of General Elijah Monroe standing in the doorway, arms crossed and a look of quiet fury etched on his face. The general's imposing presence seemed to fill the room, his years of leadership radiating from every inch of his frame. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The only sound was the dripping of paint onto the polished floor. Doyle's mind raced, scrambling for an excuse, an explanation, anything that could justify his presence. But the words wouldn't come, and then the general took a step forward, his eyes narrowing as he surveyed the scene. "You've got a lot of explaining to do," he said, his voice low and measured, like a storm brewing on the horizon. Doyle opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His carefully constructed plan had fallen apart in an instant, and now he was caught, red-handed, literally and figuratively. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. The night was far from over, and the consequences of his actions were about to unfold in ways he couldn't have imagined. The room felt suffocatingly quiet as Officer Ray Doyle stared into the piercing gaze of General Elijah Monroe. The general's calm demeanor only made the situation worse. It was the kind of calm that came from years of experience. Experience with high-pressure situations, people who lied to his face, and enemies who thought they could outsmart him. Doyle felt small, cornered like a mouse caught in the shadow of a hawk. He tried to gather his thoughts, but his mind was a scrambled mess of fear, excuses, and regret. The general finally broke the silence, his voice sharp and deliberate. "I'll ask again, what are you doing here?" Doyle swallowed hard. I heard a noise," he stammered, his voice barely steady. "I was patrolling the neighborhood, and I thought someone had broken in. I just—" "Save it." Monroe's tone was cold, unrelenting. He took another step forward, his military boots echoing on the hardwood floor. "You think I don't know what's going on here? A noise?" He glanced at the tools Doyle had dropped on the floor, the unmistakable signs of a botched break-in. His lips pressed into a thin line. "That's quite a toolkit for someone just checking out a noise." Doyle felt his stomach churn. He knew the story didn't hold up, but he wasn't ready to give in. "Not yet." "I swear, General, I was just—" "Stop talking," Monroe interrupted, his voice low but firm. His eyes flicked to the streaks of red paint splattered across Doyle's face and chest, and the faintest trace of a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I see my little precaution worked." Doyle froze, the weight of his predicament sinking in deeper. He was standing in a house he had no business being in, covered in evidence of his crime, facing a man who clearly wasn't fooled by anything he said. His cop instincts told him to try to regain control of the situation, but every move he'd made tonight had backfired. Now he was stuck. Monroe tilted his head slightly, studying Doyle as if he were a puzzle to be solved. "You know, I've dealt with men like you before," he said, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "Men who think they're untouchable, who think they can take shortcuts, cut corners, cheat their way to the top. It never ends well for them." Doyle opened his mouth to respond, but Monroe raised a hand to stop him. "Don't bother lying again. You and I both know what this is about." He gestured toward the safe, its door still firmly shut, the paint trap now useless after its explosive reveal. "You thought you could waltz in here, crack this open, and walk away with whatever you found inside." His eyes narrowed. "You didn't even bother to find out who you were dealing with." The truth of Monroe's words cut deep, but Doyle wasn't ready to admit defeat. He shifted uncomfortably, his feet shuffling against the floor. "Look," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I made a mistake, all right? Let's not blow this out of proportion. I'll leave, and we can just forget this ever happened." Monroe's laugh was short, humorless. "Forget this ever happened? Is that how you handle things on the force?" You think a badge makes you immune to consequences. He shook his head slowly, his expression hardening. Let me make one thing clear. You broke into my house. You tried to steal from me. And now you want me to turn a blind eye. You really don't know who you're dealing with. Doyle felt a flicker of anger rise beneath his fear. He wasn't used to being talked to like this, not even by a man as powerful as Monroe. Look, General, he said, his tone sharper now. I know I crossed a line, but let's not pretend this is some federal case. It's a misunderstanding, that's all. Nobody's hurt, nothing's taken. Let's just move on. Monroe's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a sharper edge. A misunderstanding? Is that what you call breaking into a man's home, destroying his property, and betraying the trust people put in you as an officer of the law? He stepped closer, towering over Doyle now, his presence as intimidating as ever. No, Officer Doyle. This isn't a misunderstanding. This is a moment of reckoning. You probably think I'm going to call the cops, Monroe said, his back to Doyle. Let them come in here, arrest you, drag you out in handcuffs. Let the whole world see what kind of man you really are. He paused, his hand resting on the edge of the desk. But that would be too easy. Too clean. Doyle's heart sank. He wasn't sure what Monroe meant, but the word sent a chill down his spine. What are you saying? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe turned to face him, his expression unreadable. You want to know what's inside that safe so badly. Fine, I'll show you. He reached into his pocket, pulling out a small key. Doyle watched in stunned silence as the general crossed the room and knelt in front of the safe, inserting the key into a hidden slot near the bottom. With a soft click, the safe's heavy door swung open. Inside, there wasn't cash, jewelry, or anything else Doyle might have expected. Instead, there were files, thick manila folders, neatly labeled and organized. There were medals, gleaming in their polished cases, and a few old photographs of men and women in uniform. Doyle squinted, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Monroe straightened up, holding one of the folders in his hand. This, he said, his voice steady, is what you risked everything for. My records, my legacy, my life's work. He opened the folder, revealing pages of documents covered in military seals and handwritten notes. You think you're clever, breaking into my house, but you don't even understand the value of what you were trying to steal. Doyle felt a wave of confusion wash over him. He hadn't expected this. He'd been chasing the idea of wealth, of something material he could sell or use to elevate himself. But now, standing in front of Monroe and his safe, he realized how little he understood about the man he'd tried to rob. Monroe closed the folder and placed it back inside the safe. I spent my entire life earning these, he said, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. Every medal, every commendation, every piece of paper in this safe represents years of sacrifice, mine and countless others. And you thought you could just take it. Doyle didn't know what to say. The weight of Monroe's words hung heavy in the air, and for the first time that night. General Monroe's glare didn't waver, his arms still crossed, his posture steady. He didn't need to shout or make threats. The weight of his silence and the way his eyes bore into Doyle did all the work. Doyle shifted uneasily on his feet, his fingers twitching at his sides. The sticky red paint clung to him like guilt, its sharp chemical smell filling the room, and there was no hiding the evidence of what he'd just tried to do. You're a cop, Monroe finally said, his voice calm but laced with steel. You're supposed to serve and protect. Yet here you are, breaking into my home. He let the words hang in the air for a moment before adding, Care to explain what you're really doing here, Officer Doyle? Doyle's mouth opened, but no words came out. His earlier excuse, the one about hearing a noise, sounded weak even to him now. What could he possibly say to a man like Monroe, who had faced battlefields, stared down enemies, and emerged victorious time and time again? A man like that could spot a lie from a mile away. Doyle finally croaked, but Monroe raised a hand, cutting him off. Don't bother. I can smell the truth a lot better than you can tell it, Monroe said, his eyes narrowing. He stepped into the room, his boots clicking softly on the floor as he approached the safe. Doyle instinctively backed up, bumping into the desk behind him. You don't seem like a man who just stumbled in here by accident, Monroe continued. His gaze flicked to the tools on the floor, lockpicks, a small crowbar, and a flashlight, and then back to Doyle. This wasn't spur of the moment, was it? You came prepared. That tells me one thing. You thought you could outsmart me. Doyle's mind raced. Every instinct told him to get out, to run, but he knew he couldn't. His heart pounded in his chest, his pulse roaring in his ears. Look, I made a mistake, all right, he said, his voice cracking. I wasn't thinking. I heard something about the safe, and the safe, Monroe interrupted, his voice sharp. He bent down, his large hand brushing over the edge of the paint-splattered safe. So you knew about this, huh? Interesting. He straightened, his eyes locking back onto Doyle. And just who told you about it? Doyle hesitated. He couldn't throw anyone else under the bus. Not now. He was already in deep enough, and dragging someone else into this mess wouldn't make it any better. No one, he muttered, his eyes darting to the floor. I guessed. Guessed. Monroe's eyebrows shot up. That's what you're going with. He shook his head, a bitter chuckle escaping his lips. Let me tell you something, Doyle. I didn't get to where I am by being fooled by bad guesses and sloppy lies. The words cut through Doyle like a blade. He felt exposed, his entire plan unraveling before him. But before he could muster a response, Monroe took another step closer, his imposing frame towering over Doyle. Do you even know what's in that safe? Monroe asked, his voice low, almost a growl. Do you have any idea what you were about to steal? Doyle shook his head weakly, his throat dry. In truth, he didn't know. The rumors he'd heard earlier in the day had been vague. Something about valuable documents, maybe some old war memorabilia. He hadn't cared much about the details at the time. All he'd seen was an opportunity, and he'd been too blinded by greed to think it through. I didn't think so, Monroe said, his tone laced with disappointment. He took a step back, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for the right words. That safe holds pieces of my life, things that can't be replaced. Medals, letters, photographs, history, my history. You think you can just walk in here and take that from me? Doyle's chest tightened. He hadn't thought about it that way. To him, the safe had been just another obstacle, something standing between him and a quick payday. But hearing Monroe's words now, he realized how personal it all was. This wasn't just about money or valuables. It was about respect. Monroe's voice softened slightly, though his eyes remained as sharp as ever. You know, I've faced men who wanted to take a lot more from me than what's in that safe. I fought to keep what's mine, to build a life for my family, and to pave the way for people who come after me. And here you are, trying to tear that down, for what? A few bucks. A thrill. Doyle wanted to respond, to say something, anything, that would make this better. But there was nothing he could say. He knew that. And so he stayed silent, his eyes fixed on the floor, the weight of his actions pressing down on him like a heavy stone. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. But then, from somewhere deeper in the house, there was a noise, a soft creak, like a door opening. Monroe's head snapped toward the sound, his eyes narrowing. Doyle felt a flicker of hope. Maybe it was someone else, a family member, a neighbor, someone who could diffuse the situation and take the focus off him. But the look on Monroe's face told a different story. "Stay here," Monroe said, his voice firm. It wasn't a request. He turned and strode out of the room, his footsteps heavy on the wooden floor. Doyle stood frozen, his heart pounding as he listened to Monroe's retreating steps. For a moment, he considered bolting. He could make it to the door, disappear into the night, and try to pretend this had never happened. But then what? Monroe knew his name, his badge number, everything about him. Running wouldn't solve anything. It would only make it worse. From the hallway came the sound of voices, Monroe's deep, commanding tone, and another voice, softer but urgent. Doyle strained to hear, but he couldn't make out the words. His curiosity tugged at him, but fear kept him rooted in place. He didn't want to give Monroe another reason to be angry. The minutes stretched on, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, Monroe reappeared, his expression unreadable. He stood in the doorway for a moment, studying Doyle as if weighing a decision. "You're lucky," Monroe said, his voice cold. "For now, you stay put. But trust me, you're not walking away from this without consequences." Before Doyle could respond, Monroe turned and disappeared back into the hallway, leaving him alone in the study. The tension in the room was suffocating, the air thick with unspoken words and unresolved conflict. Doyle sank into the nearest chair, his head in his hands, as the weight of the night pressed down on him. Whatever was happening now, he knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And the worst was yet to come. Doyle sat frozen in the study, the silence around him growing heavier with each passing second. His breathing was shallow, his thoughts a chaotic swirl of panic and regret. The weight of the situation was suffocating, and every creak of the house seemed amplified in the stillness. He tried to steady himself, but the sticky paint clinging to his uniform served as a constant, humiliating reminder of what he'd done. He glanced at the safe, its surface now streaked with red, and felt a fresh wave of shame wash over him. Somewhere down the hall, Monroe's voice rose again, commanding and deliberate, though the words remained muffled. Doyle couldn't make out the conversation, but he could hear the urgency in the general's tone. Was he calling the police? A part of Doyle almost hoped he was. Maybe it would be better to face the consequences outright than endure the crushing uncertainty of this moment. But then another thought struck him. What if Monroe wasn't calling for help? What if he was dealing with this in his own way, with his own set of rules? The house was too quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hairs on the back of Doyle's neck stand on end. He wiped his hands on his pants, the red smearing into a dull stain, and tried to think. What was Monroe planning? Why hadn't he just thrown Doyle out or had him arrested on the spot? The unanswered questions gnawed at him, each one feeding his growing anxiety. And then from the hallway came a sound that made Doyle's stomach drop, a loud, deliberate metallic asterisk click asterisk. It wasn't the sound of a phone being set down or a door closing. It was the unmistakable sound of a firearm being loaded. Doyle's chest tightened as his mind raced. Did Monroe have a gun? Of course he did. He was a general, for crying out loud. But the thought of that weapon in the hands of a man Doyle had just tried to rob sent his pulse skyrocketing. Before Doyle could decide what to do, heavy footsteps approached the study. Each step echoed ominously, growing louder and closer. Monroe reappeared in the doorway, his face shadowed in the dim light. In his hand, he held a small black pistol, the barrel pointed toward the floor, but his grip firm. Doyle's breath hitched, his body stiffening as fear surged through him. Monroe didn't say anything at first. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked on Doyle. The tension in the room was unbearable, the air so thick it felt like it could crush Doyle where he sat. When Monroe finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, but it carried an edge that sent chills down Doyle's spine. "You have no idea how close you came to losing everything tonight," Monroe said, his words slow and deliberate. He took a step forward, his gaze never leaving Doyle. "Do you even know who I am? What I've done? What I've sacrificed to protect this country and the people in it?" Doyle shook his head, his throat too dry to speak. "I've been in places you can't even imagine," Monroe continued, his voice rising slightly. "I stood on battlefields where every second meant life or death. I've led men into hell and brought them back, all while knowing that one wrong move could cost us everything. And now," he gestured to the safe with a sharp nod of his head, "now you come into my house, my sanctuary, and think you can just take what's mine without consequence." "I wasn't going to hurt anyone," Doyle blurted out, his voice shaky. "I swear, I made a stupid mistake." Monroe's eyes narrowed. "A mistake?" he repeated, his tone incredulous. "That's what you call this? A mistake is forgetting to set your alarm clock. Breaking into someone's home, stealing from them, that's not a mistake. That's a choice." Doyle's hands clenched into fists on his lap, his heart pounding so hard he thought it might burst. He opened his mouth to respond, but Monroe wasn't finished. "You think because you wear that uniform, you're untouchable," Monroe said, his voice rising. "You think that badge gives you the right to take shortcuts, to take advantage of the people you're supposed to protect." He took another step forward, the pistol still dangling at his side, but his presence overwhelming. "Let me tell you something, Doyle. That uniform means nothing if you don't respect it. And tonight, you disrespected it. You disrespected yourself. And worst of all," Doyle felt his chest tighten as Monroe's words hit him like a hammer. Every accusation, every ounce of disappointment in the general's voice cut deeper than he expected. He had prepared himself for anger, for punishment, but this wasn't just about his actions. It was about what they represented. And now, standing face to face with a man who had seen the best and worst of humanity, Doyle felt utterly exposed. But then something unexpected happened. Monroe's posture shifted slightly, his shoulders relaxing just enough to be noticeable. The intensity in his eyes softened, replaced with something Doyle couldn't quite place. Was it regret? Pity? Or was Monroe calculating his next move? "You know," Monroe began, his voice lower but still firm, "I wasn't always the man people see today. I've made my share of mistakes. Big ones. Ones that could have ruined me if someone hadn't stepped in at the right moment. And now," he paused, his eyes narrowing as he studied Doyle. "Now I'm wondering if this is one of those moments for you." Doyle blinked, thrown off by the sudden shift in Monroe's tone. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, the sound of a faint buzzing asterisk interrupted them. It was coming from the hallway, faint but persistent, like a phone vibrating on a hard surface. Monroe turned his head sharply toward the sound, his expression darkening. "Stay here," he said, his voice sharp again. And with that, he disappeared into the hallway, the pistol still in hand. Doyle sat frozen, his mind racing. What was going on? Who was calling at this hour, and why did Monroe seem so concerned? The buzzing stopped, but the tension in the air only grew heavier. Doyle leaned forward slightly, straining to hear what was happening. He could make out Monroe's voice again, low and urgent, but this time there was something different about it. It wasn't anger, it was concern. Moments later, Monroe reappeared in the doorway, his expression grim. He stood there for a moment, staring at Doyle as if weighing a decision. Then, without a word, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a second phone, and tossed it onto the desk in front of Doyle. "Answer it," Monroe ordered. Doyle hesitated, confused and more than a little scared. "What?" "Answer it," Monroe repeated, his tone leaving no room for argument. With shaking hands, Doyle picked up the phone. The screen was blank. No caller ID, no message, just the buzzing again as the call came through. He glanced up at Monroe, who gave him a curt nod, and then reluctantly pressed the green button. "Hello," Doyle's voice cracked as he spoke. There was a moment of silence on the other end, and then a voice, low, calm, and chillingly familiar, spoke. "Well, well, looks like you're not as alone as you thought, Officer Doyle." Doyle's blood ran cold. He knew that voice. It belonged to a man he thought he'd never hear from again, a man he'd hoped was long gone. His throat tightened as he struggled to find words, but the voice on the other end continued. "I heard you've been busy tonight," the man said, his tone casual but dripping with menace. "Breaking into houses, making a mess of things. That doesn't sound like the Doyle I remember. Or are you just getting sloppy?" "What do you want?" Doyle finally managed to choke out, his voice trembling. "What I've always wanted," the man replied smoothly. "A little insurance. You see, Doyle, I've got a lot riding on you staying quiet. And now here you are, caught red-handed by someone who could blow this whole thing wide open. That's a problem for both of us." Doyle's hands clenched around the phone, his mind spinning. How had it come to this? What had started as a reckless decision to break into a safe was now spiraling into something far more dangerous. He glanced up at Monroe, who was watching him intently, his expression unreadable. "Who is it?" Monroe asked, his voice cutting through the fog of Doyle's panic. Doyle shook his head, unsure of how to explain. "It's someone I used to know," he said vaguely, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe's eyes narrowed. "That's not good enough," he said. "If there's more to this than what you've told me, I need to know." "Now," the voice on the phone chuckled. "Careful, Doyle. You wouldn't want to drag the good general into this, would you? He seems like a smart man, someone who knows when to mind his own business. Maybe you should take a page out of his book." Doyle's pulse was racing. He could feel Monroe's gaze burning into him, demanding answers. But how could he explain? How could he tell Monroe that this wasn't just about the safe, or even about the foolish choices that had led him here tonight? There was a bigger game at play, one he'd been trying to escape for years. "Who are you working for?" Monroe asked, his tone sharper now, his patience clearly wearing thin. "I'm not," Doyle stammered, his voice trailing off. He couldn't finish the sentence because he didn't know what the truth was anymore. The voice on the phone cut in again, this time more serious. "You've got two options, Doyle. Walk away from that house and pretend tonight never happened, or stay there and let this get a whole lot worse, for you and your new friend." Doyle's stomach churned. The threat was clear, but so was the implication. Whatever this man wanted, he wasn't going to stop until Doyle did exactly what he was told. Monroe stepped closer, his towering presence impossible to ignore. "You're not leaving until I get the truth," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Doyle looked between the phone and the general, trapped between two forces far greater than himself. And in that moment, he realized that no matter what he chose, there was no easy way out. Doyle's fingers gripped the phone tightly, his knuckles whitening as the weight of the man's words sank in. He could feel Monroe's eyes boring into him, silently demanding answers, while the voice on the phone taunted him with a calm, unrelenting menace. The air in the room was thick with tension, every second stretching painfully as Doyle wrestled with what to do. Finally, he lowered the phone from his ear and looked at Monroe, his face pale and sweat beading on his forehead. "It's not what you think," Doyle began, his voice shaky but desperate to explain. "I got caught up in something. Years ago, I thought I was done with it, but—" He stopped, his throat tightening. The words felt like admitting defeat. "But now they're pulling me back in." Monroe's expression didn't change. His stare was unwavering, his stance solid. He folded his arms across his chest, waiting for Doyle to continue. "It's a guy I used to work with," Doyle said, his voice cracking. "A dirty cop. Back when I was just starting out, I made some bad choices, took some shortcuts. He found out, used it against me. He made me do things I'm not proud of." Doyle's eyes darted to the floor, unable to face Monroe's judgment. "I thought I'd gotten away. I thought he'd left me alone." "And now he's back," Monroe said, his voice cutting through the silence. It wasn't a question, it was a fact. Doyle nodded, his shoulders slumping. "He found out about you, about this house. He thinks there's something in the safe that he can use. I didn't even know what he was after. Doyle's voice trailed off, his hands trembling as he tried to finish. "I didn't think it through." Monroe let out a slow breath, his eyes narrowing as he processed the information. The room felt colder now, the weight of Doyle's confession hanging between them like a storm cloud. Finally, Monroe stepped closer, his towering presence making Doyle feel smaller than ever. "What's in the safe isn't what he thinks," Monroe said, his voice calm but firm. "But if he's willing to go this far, he won't stop until he gets what he wants." Doyle swallowed hard, his stomach churning with guilt and fear. "What do we do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Monroe didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned and walked to the desk, his movements deliberate and controlled. He picked up the phone Doyle had been holding, studied it for a moment, and then set it down with a loud asterisk clack asterisk. Turning back to Doyle, he spoke with a clarity that made it clear there was no room for argument. "We end this," Monroe said. "Now." Before Doyle could ask what he meant, Monroe grabbed a set of keys from the desk and motioned for Doyle to follow him. The two men moved quickly through the house, their footsteps echoing in the quiet hallways. Monroe led them to a side door, opening it to reveal a dark garage. Inside, a black SUV sat waiting, its polished surface gleaming faintly under the dim overhead light. "Get in," Monroe ordered, his voice sharp. Doyle hesitated for a moment, but then climbed into the passenger seat, his hands gripping the edge of the seat as Monroe slid into the driver's side. The general started the engine, the low rumble filling the confined space, and then backed out of the garage with practiced precision. The drive was tense, the silence between them heavy with unspoken questions. Doyle wanted to ask where they were going, but something about Monroe's expression stopped him. The man's focus was unshakable, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, as if he were heading into battle. And in a way, he was. After what felt like an eternity, Monroe finally broke the silence. "If he's watching this house, he'll come looking when he realizes you're gone," he said. "That gives us the advantage." Doyle frowned, confused. "How is that an advantage?" Monroe didn't look at him. "Because we're not at the house anymore," he said, "which means the next move is ours." The SUV pulled into a dimly lit parking lot, the tires crunching softly on the gravel. Monroe parked near the back, away from the sparse streetlights, and killed the engine. He turned to Doyle, his expression as serious as ever. "Stay here," he said. "I'll handle this." Doyle's heart raced. "Wait, what do you mean?" "Handle what?" Monroe didn't answer. He opened the door and stepped out, disappearing into the shadows before Doyle could stop him. Panic surged in Doyle's chest as he sat alone in the car, the darkness outside pressing in on him. He strained to see where Monroe had gone, but the parking lot was too dark, too quiet. And then, just as Doyle's anxiety reached its peak, he saw movement. Two figures emerged from the shadows, Monroe and another man. The second man was taller, leaner, and carried himself with a cocky arrogance that made Doyle's skin crawl. Even from a distance, Doyle recognized him instantly. It was the voice on the phone, the man who had been pulling Doyle's strings for years. The two men stopped a few feet apart, their postures tense. Doyle couldn't hear what they were saying, but he could see Monroe's body language, calm, composed, but ready for anything. The other man, by contrast, was animated, gesturing wildly as he spoke, his confidence practically radiating off him. And then it happened. The taller man reached into his coat, pulling out a small, dark object, a gun. Doyle's stomach dropped as he watched, helpless and frozen in fear. But Monroe didn't flinch. Instead, he moved with lightning speed, grabbing the man's arm and twisting it in one fluid motion. The gun clattered to the ground, and Monroe followed up with a swift, precise strike that sent the man sprawling. Doyle's jaw dropped as he watched Monroe pick up the gun, his movements smooth and practiced. He pointed it at the man on the ground, who was clutching his ribs and groaning in pain. Monroe said something, calm, deliberate, and unmistakably final. And then, without a glance back, he turned and walked toward the SUV, leaving the man behind in the shadows. When Monroe climbed back into the driver's seat, Doyle could only stare at him, his mind racing to process what had just happened. "Is he?" Doyle began, his voice trembling. "He's alive," Monroe said, cutting him off. "And he won't bother you again." Doyle wanted to ask more, to understand how Monroe could be so sure, but something in the general's tone stopped him. Instead, he sat in stunned silence as Monroe started the engine and pulled out of the parking lot. As the SUV sped through the empty streets, Doyle couldn't help but feel a strange mix of relief and unease. The immediate danger was gone, but the weight of everything that had happened still hung heavy over him. And as Monroe drove on, his face calm but unreadable, Doyle realized that the night's events had changed something in him, something he couldn't ignore. For better or worse, his life would never be the same.